In pre-calculus and calculus, we have maximums and minimums, and that's a pretty easy concept. Like the maximum is the biggest that a y gets, and a minimum is the smallest that a y gets, right? But we have two different kinds of maximum and minimums in pre-calculus. You have absolute maximums and minimums, and you have relative maximums and minimums. So let's look at this quick little drawing that I've got here. So let's say that this is my drawing. The absolute minimum is like the lowest y value. So this would be absolutely the lowest y that we see. It's the lowest, it's the minimum spot. And the absolute maximum would be this spot right here, which is absolutely the biggest y value that this thing gets to. So we have absolute biggest and absolute smallest that the y values get to. But we also have a very important concept called relative maxima and relative minima, because sometimes the peaks and valleys of things are important for us to understand. So a relative maximum would be like this spot right here and this spot right here, where it's the top of a hill. It's bigger than the stuff that's right around it. So relative to the stuff around it, it's the biggest spot. Those two would be called the relative maxima of this graph. The relative minima are places that are smaller than all of the places around it. So this spot right here would be a relative minima. Now there's an important distinction between absolute maxima and minima and relative maxima and minima. And that is that relative maxima and minima cannot be endpoints. So this guy right here, even though he's lower than the stuff to the left, he's not a relative minima because he's an endpoint. You wouldn't count these two guys as relative mins because they're endpoints. So we need to understand the difference between absolute max and mins and relative max and mins. Again, relative max and mins, think of them as the top of a hill or the bottom of a valley, never an endpoint. Absolute max and mins are just literally what is the biggest y and the smallest y you can get to. Now, up until now, I've made a big deal about how we always report the x's and we always report the x's, and plot twist, this is where we're going to break that rule. For absolute and relative maxima and minima, we actually don't report the x's, we report the y's. It is one of the only times we talk about y's. All right, so let's look at this example right here and see if we can find the relative maxima and the relative minima. So where can we find the relative max? So we can see that this point right here, this 4, 6, is a relative max. It's a spot that's bigger than the stuff right around it, relative to the stuff around it. So what is the relative maximum? Well, that maximum y value, that tippy top, happens at that happens to be y equals 6 is the max. Where this gets a little confusing is sometimes we don't want to just know what is the max of 6, but we want to know what x does that max happen at. So where does the relative max occur? That maximum occurs at 4. Think of this in terms of real world stuff. What if I told you if you can make 4,000 widgets, then you will have $6 million in profit? So wouldn't this spot right here be really, really good for you to know? Because we know if we can make 4,000 widgets, we will maximize our profit at $6,000. So the maximum profit is $6,000, but it's important to know that's producing 4,000 widgets. So the max is the y, where it happens is the x. It's really confusing, but I think y'all can get this. All right, let's find our relative minimum. Again, relative minimum is smaller than the stuff that's around it. It can't be an endpoint. So this spot right here is our relative minimum. The y value that this is at is y equals 2. So the minimum, the relative minimum is 2, and it occurs at x equals 2. So the x value where it occurs is also 2 in this case. So remember, when we're reporting maxes and mins, we want to report what is the y value, but it's also important for us to understand it happens at a particular x value as far as max and mins go. Now, We can also, oops, sorry, y'all. We can also look at this and ask, what is the absolute max and the absolute min? So, what is the absolute maximum of this graph? Well, the absolute highest y value can be an endpoint, and that is happening here. So the absolute maximum happens to be y equals 10. And what is the x value that this occurs at? Just like with relative maximums, it's important to know that that happens when x is 0. So what is the absolute biggest y value? Oh, that is 10. What is the relative y value that we have, the relative maximum? That one was 6. What is the absolute minimum of this graph? Well, the absolute smallest y value happens at this point, and that y value is -2, but it occurs at x equals 6. We need to understand the difference between absolute and relative max and mins, and then where do those items occur?